On this episode of the Mesa Arts Center podcast, we talk to Dr. Matthew Sandoval. Dr. Sandoval is an associate teaching professor at Barrett the Honors College in downtown Phoenix. He is also an ASU Social Transformation Lab Fellow and a member of ASU's Chicano/Latino Faculty and Staff Association. Dr. Sandoval is currently researching the transborder holiday Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, which makes him the perfect guest for this podcast, as the Mesa Arts Center is pleased to be celebrating its annual Dia de los Muertos festival here at the Mesa Arts Center on October 19th and 20th. It is a free event and it offers a variety of features, performances, and more in celebration of the memories of the deceased. Please enjoy this podcast, and thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome to the Mesa Arts Center podcast. I am Tomas Stanton. I'll be your host for the day, and I'm here with the one and only Dr. Matthew Sandoval. How you doing, my guy?
I'm all right, man.
Yeah? Doing good?
I'm doing really well.
We know each other pretty well, so
Yes,
I feel that smile on your face.
Oh,
is
yeah.
like, this is funny to hear me so professional, but I can reel it in when I need to.
No, I dig it. I'm also just like, anytime I get a chance to sit down, break bread with you in any capacity and have a conversation is a good thing.
Yeah.
So, this is great.
I want to say thank you first and foremost, because you've been a major influence in my life for a while. And I think the fact that when I reached out to you was like a week ago, and I was like, hey, will you be on the podcast? And you were like, absolutely. When and where, and that, I'm just like, man, I'm glad I have friends like that.
Hell yeah.
Because you're kind of a big deal. Like, first of all, you're a doctor.
Sure.
Okay. That takes a lot of time and
Oh my
energy,
God.
right?
So much.
You're a professor. Okay. You teach in the honors college at ASU. So you're not just like you're like upper class professor. Okay.
I'm a ratchet academic, though.
No, but that's what I love about it, because you teach in the honors college, but you bring like all of your influence, which is really, really cool, from hip hop to growing up in New Mexico, and really what we're going to talk about today is like your focus of study is really like Dia de los Muertos, right?
Yeah.
So much so that your name is Dr. Muertos.
Professor Muerte.
The professor
Dr.
of death.
Yes.
That's crazy. Yeah. So I want to say, how did that happen? Like, when was the origins of your interest in Dia de los Muertos?
So there's a long story, and I'll try and be quick with this. But, before I was ever a professor, I was in the performing arts as like a professional performer. I did modern dance and I did theater. And one of my first international tours as a modern dancer was in Guatemala.
Oh, cool.
And when I was in Guatemala, it was early November, and I was there right when they were doing Dia de los Muertos. And that was actually my first exposure to Day of the Dead. Was in Guatemala. It wasn't in Mexico at all. It was actually, I was like, whoa, this is a Guatemala thing. I always thought that this was a Mexican thing.
Yeah.
That was my first exposure to it.
How old were you at that point?
I would have been in my early 20s, probably like 22, 23, 24, somewhere around
Okay.
there. Early 2000s.
Yeah.
And I was really taken with it. So these two things happen simultaneously. I encounter Dia de los Muertos in Guatemala and, see the skull and skeleton iconography, the altars, the offerings, and all that stuff. And I'm like, wow, what a beautiful cultural celebration. And I'm encountering this at the same time that I had just lost my father. I was, like I said, in my early 20s. I didn't have any tools whatsoever to know how to deal with the loss of my dad. Like, literally none.
And he was a major influence in your life.
Major influence in my life. I mean, it's my pops. So, like, we had a rocky road of a relationship. But, like, it was a hero to me. You know what I mean? And I lost him from suicide. No problems talking about all that.
Yeah.
So that it was like a double hurt. And I was just in a really bad spot. And there was something about seeing Day of the Dead where I was like, oh, people don't treat death as morbid in all cultures. Like there's a way to like honor death, to not be so scared of it, etc. So that was my first like brush with Day of the Dead. Now I say this as a Mexican American, but Dia de los Muertos isn't celebrated by all people who are Mexican or Latino, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And we could get into that later, but like I didn't grow up with it as part of my culture. And then when I moved to Los Angeles, this would have been when I was like in my late 20s. When I got to LA, I was like, oh man, Day of the Dead is a thing here. It's a major thing. And I had some friends who brought me into the culture of Day of the Dead to understand it at a more depth.
Yeah.
Like, what's the history of it? What does this mean for people? And then when you start participating in it, then you can kind of start to understand it. So I've been messing around with Day of the Dead for about 20 plus years now. First, it hit me as like a spiritual thing, as like here's some tools to help you heal from death. And then it just became an intellectual pursuit because I wanted to know more. It became simultaneously like an academic pursuit, which is to say I had a lot of questions about Day of the Dead. But then it was also simultaneously a spiritual pursuit because I'm also learning more about myself, learning more about my culture, learning more about my cultural history.
Yeah.
So I've been at it for a long, long time.
That's one of the things that I love about Dia de los Muertos, and I guess a shame on me because we didn't give any context to maybe those who don't know what Dia de los Muertos is. Right? Yeah. Everybody should know, right? Clearly, you know, like, but it is a festival, right? Yes. That celebrates the afterlife. Is my kind of take on it, and it is predominantly celebrated in Latin America, right? And what I think is so interesting about Dia de los Muertos is that it really causes you to think about death.
Yes.
In a very nuanced way as a human, because for me, just death scares me. It has always scared me since I was a kid.
Well,
so we're old enough to remember arcades and video games, right? Where you put the actual quarter in the arcade. And the first time I really grappled with death was at an arcade. I was playing a game, and I had a certain amount of quarters, and I would die, and then I would have 10 seconds to put another quarter in to continue, right? And then you continue where you died in the video game. And so I put my quarter in, died again, put my quarter in. I was like trying to complete the game. And then when I no longer had any more quarters, the game was over. And that night I was thinking about that, and I was like, oh, death is when you have no more quarters and it's really over.
Whoa.
Right? I might have been 12.
Yeah.
And so from that point on, I've kind of always like tried to just put death as far away in my intellectual brain as possible because it's so scary to deal with.
Sure.
But then Dia de los Muertos, when I was introduced to that later on in life, we're talking 30s, it was an opportunity for me to really understand the beauty of it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. I love that. One of the reasons why I'm so attached to this holiday is because it's deeply philosophical in a number of ways, both in the way that it extends into the past and the way that it extends into the future. And here's what I mean by that is that in honoring those who you've lost, you're inherently honoring your ancestors. So like when I make altars for my family, I'm not making altars for people who have died. Like my grandmother died last week. I'll be making an altar for her. But I'll be making altars that also honor my deep ancestors, my great-great-grandmas, my triple-great-grandmas, et cetera, because I know a little bit about them and I want to honor them. So it's a holiday that allows me to put myself within a lineage that extends into the deep past, right? To acknowledge the fact that I am a human who's moving forward because a torch has been passed to me from my ancestors. And I love that. It gives me so much warmth to think of it like that. And Dia de los Muertos is also the opportunity for me to think about the future because we surround ourselves with death imagery. Like I'll sometimes wear like skeleton, skull, T-shirts, or sometimes a mask and stuff like that. And it's also an acknowledgement that I too will die in the future.
Yeah.
Hopefully not in the near future,
Yeah.
but I will
Yeah.
die. So you have to deal with your own mortality in a way that, if you choose to face it squarely, can give you some sense of resolve. Like, hey, I'm going to die just like everybody's going to die.
Yeah.
There's truly nothing to be scared about. It is part of the human experience. Here's a way for me to remind myself. Here's 2 days of the year in which I get to remind myself that I'm immortal and that that's okay and that that's what makes me deeply, deeply human.
Yeah. It's interesting because I learned about Dia de los Muertos like the year before Coco.
Oh, okay.
Right. So I had at least a little bit of like, cause it's funny because when Coco came out, right. And I was playing poker the other day with someone, and he was from Mexico, and we were talking about alabrijes, right. And I think he thought that I didn't know what an alabrije was, and which is fine, right? And I was like, yeah, no, I know an alabrije. And
I work at Mesa Arts Center.
Well, and then his first response to that was like, oh, Coco. And I was like, no, I knew about it before Coco,
Okay.
but in full context, I knew about it a year before Coco. So, but what I love about Coco, because my first experience with this facing death and what it is, I was a child. I now have children. My youngest is 7. And, we've watched Coco multiple times with Santiago. And what I love about Coco is that it connects 2 of my favorite things, which is storytelling and family. Right. And what I've gathered from that, it's almost like the cheat code to death. Right. And I want to ask you if this is actually true, because in Coco, one of the main concepts, it's like what you said, it's you're honoring your ancestors, your ancestors that are so far back that you would never know about them unless somebody passed that story on from generation to generation, which is amazing. And it doesn't happen a lot.
No.
But then there's the point where the guy who he disappears into dust, right? Because the last person that remembered him is no longer living, and therefore if the person who remembers you last is no longer living, then you're gone forever. Yeah. And Santiago and I were both tripping out because he's like, so where did he go? And I'm like, I don't know, bro. But I'll tell you what, to avoid that, this is the cheat code. I was like, to avoid that, let's never forget anybody.
100.
Right.
Which is why, and I don't think this gets talked about enough. Storytelling is such an integral part of Dia de los Muertos, precisely because of that. Like, it's not just that you make an altar that has your grandma's photo on it and stuff like that. It's also that you gather with family in order to tell stories to ensure that that person continues to live on in the mind, at the very least, that there's a story attached. Like, my baby is 9 weeks old, so she's not going to understand this. But next year, I'll start telling her stories during Day of the Dead about the ancestors that she'll never meet, like my dad.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
She'll know about my dad because of the stories that I tell around Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
And that ensures that my pops doesn't disappear like homie from
like
Coco.
homie. Yeah.
His name I forget right
yeah. Now. Well, that's ironic, right? We forgot his name.
Oh, damn it. No, he's dead.
He's double dead.
Oh.
Now. Yeah. It's so important. And I think that it really brings a festival and a festive kind of vibe to something that we all grapple with as humans. Sure. And so talk a little bit about the culture of the festivals as it has evolved, maybe specifically in America, right? Because we host one of the largest Dia de los Muertos festivals here at the Mesa Arts Center.
Sure.
You've been on the board. You were an intricate part of making that what I think is like really, really dope. So what about the more commercialized festivals versus the more organic kind of aspects of it?
Yeah, I would say the long history of Dia de los Muertos, and this is like, we're talking like hundreds of years old, this cultural practice, it's always had a festive component to it. It's always had a commercial component to it,
Mm-hmm.
because enterprising individuals are going to use large gatherings in order to sell stuff.
There you go.
That is literally also the history of humanity as well.
Yeah.
So Day of the Dead isn't excused from commercialization in that way. The way that Day of the Dead developed in the United States specifically, because there's a long history of how it developed in Mexico and Latin America, of course, but in the U.S., it's still a relatively recent cultural phenomenon. Part of that has to do with the fact that when Mexican Americans specifically, we'll just concentrate on that, like when Mexicans moved into the Southwest, they didn't have cemeteries for themselves, right? So they couldn't gather at cemeteries in order to celebrate Day of the Dead. And so Day of the Dead didn't necessarily die off, but it kind of went underground a little bit. It wasn't celebrated publicly, certainly not as publicly as it is in Mexico, where it's like a huge community celebration. In the United States, in like the early 20th century, the early 1900s, it wasn't that big here. In the 1970s is when Day of the Dead really starts to pop off in the U.S. Now, that has to do with the Chicano movement, the Mexican-American civil rights movement, in which Mexican-Americans, as a way of saying, like, yo, we have our own civil rights movement too. We are also a part of the United States. We are also not afraid to hide who we are. We are going to let you know. We are going to show part of our culture. And part of our culture is Day of the Dead. So you had the resurgence of Day of the Dead in the United States. And that includes even here. Like there is the Cultural Coalition, Carmen and Zarco Guerrero started to do Day of the Dead celebrations here in the late 1970s here in Mesa.
Yeah.
And then as it becomes more and more popular, you start to see more and more Latin American Chicano communities celebrating Day of the Dead. They're always celebrating it. I would say this, that the Chicanos who are celebrating it also tend to be in the arts.
Okay.
So then it starts to migrate into like museums and art galleries, since like people who are doing arts work are also doing cultural work.
Yeah.
Like those two things
Arts
are
and
synonymous.
culture.
Yeah. They're synonymous. So all over the United States at major museums, galleries, arts institutions, you see Day of the Dead start to spring up in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s as a way of just honoring the beautiful artwork that surrounds Day of the Dead, because Day of the Dead is also filled with beautiful artwork.
Very colorful.
Super colorful, very visual, very aesthetic, etc. So it's a way of honoring that part of it. But because they're art and culture institutions, it's a way of saying, like, yo, we extend our invitation into the community of Latin Americans, Chicanos, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. The Mesa Arts Center one is really quite special. And I don't actually know that people give it as much props as it deserves. Okay. So first of all, it's one of the only 2-day festivals in the United States. Most institutions who put on a Dia de los Muertos festival, it takes place over one day. It's like on a Saturday, usually before November 1 and 2. And it's like, yo, here's our one day. And it's usually for a couple hours. And that's it. MAC is one of the only places that does it for 2 days. Yeah. It's also one of the largest in the United States. I don't know that they bill themselves as much as they should for that. But like they get 50,000 people here over the course of 2 days. Yeah. That makes it incredible. That makes it one of the largest celebrations of Day of the Dead in the United States. I think the only one that's bigger than that is also a 2-day festival that takes place in San Antonio over 2 days. But San Antonio they've been doing Day of the Dead since like 100 years now. Yeah. So it's huge there. But the one at Mesa Arts Center is really quite lovely. And I love the way that they concentrate on the performing arts here. Mm-hmm. Obviously because it's the Mesa Arts Center, but the dance, the music, the concentration of like saying, let's look specifically at how beautiful this can be and how expressive it can be. Yeah. That's what makes this one really unique. And I've been blessed to be a part of it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, look, we've been blessed to have you a part of it, because I think that everything you just said, I would agree, not as a person who works for the Mesa Arts Center, but as an individual who really has grown within that festival, my knowledge base, my family, my kids, like, it's a big part of our lives. And, it does take a small army to make it happen. And, but having you involved, when you came in, you really laid some really cool frameworks for the festival, right? And so I think that was really important. I love that we celebrate the art and culture aspect of Dia de los Muertos. As a poet and as a fellow poet and storyteller, you introduce, this is one of the things that you came in and you know, like injected our festival with, is the literary component of Dia de los Muertos, specifically with the Calavera poems, right? Talk a little bit about kind of that part.
Yeah, so I think I'm glad that you signaled that, because I feel like that is what I've contributed here. Because I'd been coming to the Mesa Arts Center Day of the Dead before I even jumped on the ship with you, thanks to you, actually. And one of the things that I wanted to do was try to introduce that, precisely because that's not a component that you see at many Day of the Dead celebrations in the United States at all. And increasingly, it's something that's being lost even in the Mexican celebrations, is the literary component. And as a poet storyteller, I'm like, yo, this is such a major part of the thing. We can't lose this part of it. It's not just the face paint. It's not just altars. It's also this storytelling component. So the Calavera poems are like these satirical poems that come out on Day of the Dead or around Day of the Dead, in which you write a poem for a person pretending that they're dead, which is completely just like, it's so kind of morbid and funny. It's morbid and funny, but that's also the spirit of the holiday,
and that's the point.
That is precisely the point. Is let's pretend that Tomas is dead, and if he was dead, how would I be able to knock this guy? How could I make fun of this dude if he was dead? What are the like little chinks in his armor that I might be able to like poke fun at, as a way of saying, like, listen, this is funny, but also like, I got love for you in some way too.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? Like, there is that component. So the Calavera poem is like a satirical poem written as if somebody's dead. And when you write about them in that way, you get to make fun of them.
Yeah.
So, you know, I got a chance to like make that video with you, try and help spread the word about these particular poems, but then also thinking about Day of the Dead as an opportunity to tell stories and write poems about death in general, as a way to write, like, how do you write about someone, not just satirically, but how can you write about someone in a loving way, like
honoring
truly honoring them.
Yeah.
Because storytelling is also a way of dealing with death too.
Yeah.
It's not just building altars is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, that is absolutely healing technology. I've become really adept at starting to talk about like ofrendas as healing technology, because I think they are. But I also think that telling stories is a form of healing technology too.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I think, you know, whenever someone in my life has passed away, right, there is a progression, right? Which is a part of the festival as well too. What is it? The procession, right?
Oh yeah.
Right. But there's this procession or progression of like deep despair and hurt, right? Then family coming together and celebrating. And it always leads to storytelling. You tell stories about, you know, my wife's brother, my brother-in-law, Lalo, he passed away tragically a couple years ago. And it was a very, very difficult time for my wife's family. And ironically, it was close to around Dia de los Muertos. And so we were able to honor him through, you know, an altar. But Lalo was just a character. Like, he was one of the craziest dudes I've ever met. And, you know, we still talk about him all the time. And you know, we say he helped build the house that my wife and I live in. And, you know, so we're always like, yo, man, Lalo did that, and Lalo's here. And, you know, Theo Lalo, we talk about him with our kids. And so you're right. Storytelling is important. And what I love about the Calavera poems is the satirical part, because like humor is a way to deal with death and sadness, right? Where 100. You just like, if you're not crying, you're laughing.
Absolutely.
You know, so.
Absolutely. No, it's such an integral part. And the storytelling, this is how it ties to poetry, is that for Day of the Dead, you have to craft those stories. You have to craft those poems. In the same way that you don't make an altar just by throwing a bunch of random stuff on a table. You know what I mean? Like, you take care to shape, to craft. That's all the same work that goes into storytelling and poetry as well. You have to take time to craft. It's not just about telling the story of the dead. Like, you have to craft it in a way that truly honors them in the way they need to be honored.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, man, this has been great. This is such a a joyful conversation for me because, again, I love that you have taken your experiences and infiltrated academia, right? Because that's a whole nother podcast where we could talk about all the things I hate about academia. But the fact that I know that there's guys like you there and you're bringing culture that is really important to academia, and you're creating legacy, and I think that's really important, man. Like, I think you will be celebrated for many generations because of the work that you're doing, and I appreciate you, and I'm so grateful that you shared this with the folks. So that they can see that, and hopefully they'll come and check out the festival this year, if not here, somewhere else. So
I hope they do.
Yeah, man. Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate you, man. Have a great day.
Yes.
And I never know how to end these things, so I'm just going to say zippity-doo-dah.
Peace.
Peace.